to 10. Slowly.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me for this special episode of Containing Multitudes. I feel particularly nervous about this because instead of being in conversation with someone else, I'm going to be presenting the first section of a book in progress called Shekhinah Speaks, and explaining a bit about the project. And this is I've read these poems individually over the past year or two, but I've never tried to read them in sequence before. And so this feels like a world premiere to me, and I'm very grateful to everybody who is here for that. I also feel at this point in the pandemic that I should separately introduce my hair, which seems to be developing a life of its own. And probably a month or two from now, we'll be reading alongside me in unison. So tune back in for that. The Shekhinah Speaks project has grown slowly over a couple of years. It began really when I was invited to University of Colorado seminar on embodied Judaism. They do a symposium on embodied Judaism, and this particular year their subject was the Shekhinah, and they invited me to read poetry at it, and for no particular reason. They weren't aware of me. I'd written a couple of poems, Shekhinah-y poems, but they weren't aware of that. They just thought that I might be a poster girl for embodied Judaism in some way. And I thought, well, you know, if you're going to go to a symposium like this, everybody's talking about the Shekhinah, you should really write some Shekhinah poems. And it was scary easy to write Shekhinah poems. It turned out that I had always wanted to be God when I grew up. And the chance to take that role in poetry and make the divine say the things that I had always thought the divine should be saying and thinking, and also to be mouthy and irreverent, because who's going to tell the Shekhinah how she can and can't talk? All of that was a great deal of fun. And I read the poems, and I felt marvelously good about it afterward. And then a few months later, I was between writing projects, and I thought, you know, maybe I should go, but those were easy to write. I'm always thinking, yeah, let's find something easy to write. So that'll knock out a book of Shekhinah poems. That would be a blast. And when I went back to them, I realized that the things that I had enjoyed so much about writing them were now making me kind of uncomfortable. In the meantime, I'd written this book of trans theology, and a lot of it was about idolatry, basically, the way human beings create the divine in our own image for various reasons. And that gave me a real sense of embarrassment when I read these poems, which was deliberate idolatry. You know, they were poems in which I was deliberately making the divine into kind of a sock puppet that would say what I'd say. So, Shekhinah, what do you think? Well, Joy, I think just what you think. And so I was painfully aware that that's not really the way the divine works. In fact, whenever the divine is saying exactly what we think and want to hear, book, but I realized I was still curious, like, what would the Shekhinah say? So the Shekhinah, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a concept that was mostly elaborated by the mystical branch of Judaism called Kabbalism, although it starts much earlier than that. It's an idea of the female or feminine aspect of divinity. So as Judaism becomes elaborated after the destruction of the temple, we gradually get this association of God with maleness. It's not actually there isn't that much of it in the Torah. If you go back to the various ways that the Torah talks about God and you ignore the male pronouns, Hebrew is a gendered language. So there was going to be either all kinds of male pronouns or all kinds of female pronouns for God. It's not surprising that in a patriarchal culture, they went with the male pronouns. But if you ignore those pronouns, you see that God is referred to through all kinds of imagery. Some imagery is explicitly male imagery, like God is a man of war. Some of it is animal imagery. God is like the horns of a wild ox. And some of it is female associated imagery, God crying out like a woman in childbirth, for example. There doesn't seem to be a strong commitment in the Torah to a gendered image of God, but over the centuries, there is an association of God with maleness, and this male God is associated with transcendence and power and judgment and speaking and lots of other things that won't be surprised to anybody who's met men, taking up a lot of space, laying down the law, various kinds of things like that. So, but that creates a hole. It creates two kinds of holes. One is that the gender binary really works as a binary. And I think that there was theological pressure on the theological imagination. If you have a male God, then maleness is really defined in opposition to and superiority to a femaleness. So I think that probably was working on it. But more importantly, perhaps, the more God was seen as transcendent and distant from humanity, the more that created a hole in Judaism, in the way that people could relate to God, particularly, I think, after the destruction of the temple and the rituals that were designed. They were called sacrifices were called korbanot, which means closeness. So you lose the rituals that are designed to enact your closeness to God, and you have an idea of God as a transcendent being, and so that creates, well, I guess Christianity would say it creates a marketing opportunity. It creates an opportunity to imagine a God who really knows what it's like to be human, because the transcendent God seems increasingly distant from humanity. So the Shekhinah grows out of these impulses from a verb which means to dwell. And the Shekhinah develops over the centuries and is imagined as the female aspect of God, who the gender binary tells us is going to be the subordinate complement of God. So the Shekhinah is immanent instead of transcendent. This is the aspect of God that dwells with humanity, that experiences what human beings experience, who celebrates when we celebrate and weeps when we weep, who goes into exile when Israel goes into exile. I think the rabbis weren't concerned with whether the Shekhinah went into exile when other nations went into exile, but if you imagine an aspect of God that's really immanent and is experiencing everything human beings are experiencing, that would be the case. So the Shekhinah is always there, always present, feeling with us, mourning and celebrating with us. And again, because this is the way the gender binary works, lacking all of the qualities that the male identified aspect of God has. So the Shekhinah is not represented as powerful, is not represented as speaking. I don't have examples of really how the Shekhinah talks. God sends nations into exile, the Shekhinah goes into exile. That's kind of the way that works. So in the Jewish feminism that arose in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, looking to build up female presence in Judaism, had a debate about the Shekhinah. Many Jewish feminists said, oh, the Shekhinah is just what we're looking for. We're looking for female-based conceptions of divinity that will help at least balance things out, or also if we're separatists, we can have a completely female-centered version of Judaism. And other feminists said, you know what? The Shekhinah is kind of a Trojan horse when it comes to feminism. The Shekhinah is a creature of the gender binary. And if you embrace the Shekhinah, you are going to be embracing the gender binary out of which the Shekhinah grows. So one of the critics of the idea of a Shekhinah-based feminist Judaism, Marcia Falk, warned against her and said, what I really want is not the Shekhinah, who's a creature of the gender binary. I want an autonomous female idea. I want an idea of what it is to be a woman that is not defined in opposition to or subordination to maleness or men. And when I read that, I was thrilled because I'd gone on my own gender journey and I'd realized, I'd started out longing to fit into, to move from the male side of the gender binary to the female side of the gender binary, and had realized after some years of living as myself that I was never going to fit gender binary definitions of what it was to be a woman, but this is still the way that I identify. So reading this phrase about an autonomous female, an idea of the female that's not defined in opposition to maleness, which is to say, you don't say, well, if men are this, women have to be that, and vice versa. That was really resonating for me personally. And it also made sense of the Shekhinah. That was like the first breakthrough where I thought, oh yeah, the Shekhinah is female, but doesn't give up anything to be female. How does the Shekhinah speak? Because that's the big problem. If you're writing poems where the Shekhinah is speaking, you have to say, how does the Shekhinah speak? And I realized, oh, the Shekhinah speaks any way she wants to. She doesn't feel like she always has to cross her legs. She wants to swear, she swears, She shouts when she wants to shout. She whispers when she wants to whisper. There's nothing about gender binary norms that are going to constrain her use of language. But I still had the problem of knowing what I wanted the Shekhinah to say. And how could I turn my poetry into a space where the Shekhinah could speak, and as opposed to me just speaking with this sort of divine sock puppet. And to do that, I decided to go back to a method that I'd also used in, overused maybe, actually, in learning to write as myself. The first thing that I did was I tried to create poems out of words and phrases that I had found in women's magazines, because I wanted to see if I could use officially certified language by women, for women, about women things. Could I make poetry out of that? That would be a test. What I discovered was that using words that weren't mine released voices and ways of thinking that I, had censored out of myself over the years, because I associated them with femaleness and I wasn't going to allow to touch that. And so that was great. Anybody who has created great refrigerator magnet poetry has had a similarly liberating experience. When you say, these words aren't mine, these sentences aren't mine, you're suddenly freed from all of the social constraints that normally hobble our imagination when we use language. And which I work very hard to instill into my comp students. I want to hobble their imaginations about how to use language so that they make sense and stuff like that. So I thought, okay, I need to do something similar. I need to use language that's not mine in order to get beyond my own ideas. And I also knew that I needed certified God language, because honestly, I don't know what kind of words a deity uses. But here, the Hebrew Bible has plenty of examples. And the best poetry, I would say, in the voice of God, in the Torah, yeah, the book of Job is definitely a contender, but I'm going to go with 2nd Isaiah's divine monologues. Verse for verse, it's pretty hard to beat that. So I decided I would sample Isaiah's monologues, which is I'd pick a passage and I would just take words and phrases out of it and mix them up, turn them into refrigerator magnets. And then I needed to combine them with language that would signify femaleness to create a Shekhinah voice. And so Cosmopolitan was about as female a source as I could think of. Of course, I would pre-internet, I would never have done this, because the covers of Cosmopolitan scare me too much to go near that magazine. But on the internet, you can just read the articles without looking at the pictures. So I overcame that. But I was thinking, like, I can only do this if there are Cosmopolitan articles that resonate with passages in Isaiah. Is that really possible? And so I did a search. I found a passage in Isaiah and I did a search on a key term, and something popped up. And I want to read an example of that resonance in a second. But I just want to say this is the first section of the book. That section is called Revelation, and the Shekhinah exists outside of time. So all of the poems are speaking simultaneously. Human beings move around in time, but for the Shekhinah, our lives and all of us exist simultaneously all at once. And so we experience sequence, but she doesn't. But when we intersect with the Shekhinah as she speaks in these poems, this is a moment in which she's talking, but we're not yet listening and able to hear her. So the passage from Isaiah that this poem grows out of includes the language, "For a long time I've kept silent. I've been quiet and held myself back. But now, like a woman in childbirth, I cry out, I gasp and pant." And the Cosmopolitan article is, "Why are American women dying in childbirth?" The poem is called Bearing You. And one other note, anything that's great in these poems is the Shekhinah. Anything that isn't, I think you should ascribe to me. So, I cry out like a woman in labor. I ache, dilate, set myself on fire to open a path for you. New things flow out of me. Justice leaks down my leg. I make the same mistakes over and over, marrying heaven to earth, spirit to flesh, filling you with weeks and hours, pressures, anxieties, popping sensations. I unveil your organs, open your eyes, straighten your crooked places, but you don't understand my contractions. You don't know how to react when I give you hands, hallways, mountains, coasts, backwoods frying pans. I make you feel icky. I irritate your nervous system and you keep asking for water, drip, drip, dragging your soul like an IV behind you on your way to the nurse or the sea or the toilet or the weekend or to prison or to bed, begging to be born into some other kind of body, unmarked by sex and race and gender, or better yet, born into no body at all, into the unmidwived light of forever. But you are what you are because I am what I am, a whisper working through your blood, an umbilical glory cascading to earth from heaven, fusing your darkness to my darkness, feeding your life from my life. Natalia saw some of the early Shekhinah poems I wrote, and I didn't realize then, but I was starting in with what I now think of as the end of the sequence, the more celebratory poems, the poems in which the Shekhinah is getting to marry the human you that she's speaking to. And so I started with Dessert, but as I was working on the sequence and more poems were coming to me, I found myself very reluctantly, this was not my idea, this was her idea, pushed into difficult material, Cosmo articles and parts of Isaiah. If you read the divine monologues in Isaiah, God is often celebrating in Isaiah, but not always. There's some pretty tough stuff there. And if you read Cosmopolitan, you'll find a lot of things about very difficult women's issues also. And one of the things the Shekhinah keeps wanting me to do is use articles that are about horrible situations related to abortion legislation and miscarriages and things like that. This is so this is not a poem that I was wanting to write, but here we go. It's called Stillborn, and the passage from Isaiah includes the lines, "The officials of Zoan have become fools. The leaders of Memphis are deceived." And the Cosmo article is, 19-year-old Skylar Richardson says she had a stillborn baby. So why is she on trial for murder? Your half-born spirit makes you stagger like a palm branch or a tail, still asking questions, still melting with fear, still born and still growing. Something inside is disattached, something with a cord around its neck that could have been a human being, instead of a horrible implication born like reeds along the Nile, spreading like nets on water. Fools rip up your carpets, scraping for the child you can't stop losing. Authority, community, charred bones, idols, corpses of wisdom, pharaohs whose Niles run dry. I'm not a pharaoh. I'm the neighbor who's always watching, the friend whispering about your weight, the doctor who knows why you feel sick, the officer who tells you you're under arrest for being the child you bury. You see me as a prosecutor or a judge, but I also cover your body with flowers, pinks and sweetheart roses. When they wilt, I remain after the prom, and there in the casket, you are still my favorite color, a cloud I continue to ride, even when you stop moving. I bear what you bear, bury what you bury, preserve you like a remaining hope, unequivocally, even when you're guilty, vilified, blaming yourself, parched like a riverbed, pining away, stillborn or miscarried. I surround you like a uterus, and you are still my baby. So one of the things that you, thank you. One of the things that you notice in there that's tricky about God and tricky about the Shekhinah is that the Shekhinah really does not have befores and afters. You know, everything is in the present tense for her. I was reading some of these poems in Texas at a Slichot Shabbaton, and a man, elderly man, raised his hand and he asked me, what have I learned from the Shekhinah about the nature of death? Is there a life after death? Because he'd lost a child years ago, and he was still hoping that his child was alive somewhere. And I thought, you know, this is really an awkward, the kind of question poets don't usually get at poetry readings. So, is there a life after death? What has God told you about that? But the truth is, I've had these glimpses of what this Shekhinah perspective might be like. And it's weird because from her perspective, there isn't actually a death. Like, because time just is all at once. It's more like, time is more like space to her. Like, we wouldn't say that this end of the box is alive and that end of the box is dead, and then outside the box, the whole box has disappeared. Our lives are kind of like just collections of living moments, and she's at those moments all the time. And a lot of the way that she talks is addressed to us at different moments in our lives that are for her happening all the time. He looked very unhappy about this. Yes, Doctor Who. Yes, exactly. A great working out of a really non-human relation to time. Yeah, that's a great example. Most of these poems are not personal. I mean, they're deliberately not personal. I'm trying not for them not to be personal, but the one I'm about to read did grow right out of my life. I had the Yom Kippur from Hell. I guess that's not a phrase you're ever supposed to say, but my mother, who has dementia, got terribly ill, called me, and she was like on the floor, and it was Kol Nidre night, and I had to come, you know, get her to the emergency room. We spent all night in the emergency room. Somebody actually died while we were in there. I heard them dying and everything. But my mother couldn't remember what was going on for more than about 90 seconds. So every minute to a minute and a half, she would ask me where we were and what had happened, and I would have to recount the whole thing again. And at a certain point, I realized, oh, this is how the Shekhinah feels with us, that she's always telling us the same things over and over and over again, and we never remember for more than a minute and a half. And from one lifetime to the next, from one generation to the next, she has to keep saying the same things again and again. So this poem, I guess my part of it is for my mother. It's called Forgetting. And it was easy to find the texts. I knew I was going to write a poem called Forgetting. And in Isaiah, that I found the passage where God says, Zion says, the Lord has forsaken me. My Lord has forgotten me. Can a woman forget her baby or disown the child of her womb? Though she might forget, I never could forget you. And in Cosmo, what came up first was an article called What It's Like to Lose Your Entire Memory. You don't remember anything. How I formed you in your mother's womb, nursed you, bathed you, taught you to talk, led you to springs of water. You're clueless as an infant. When I tell you to shout for joy, you hear a bicycle or a cat. Sometimes memories of me come back like children you forgot you had. A garden, snow, an image of your mother, your best friend, your brother, or a cop, or afternoon. The heavens shout, mountain becomes road, gardenias burst into song. Whose are these, you wonder? Then you feel forgotten. Then you forget and feel forgotten, like an infant who falls asleep at the breast and wakes up hungry again. Your mother may forget you, child, but I never forget. I engrave your name on the palms of my hands. I show you trees. I lay you down in the grass. I shower you with examples of my love, sex and birds, librarians and life skills, emotions, sunlight, compassion. Nothing connects. Every dawn, every generation, I have to teach you again. This is water. This is darkness. This is a body fitting your description. That's a crush. This an allergic reaction. This is your anger. This is mine. This is me reminding you to eat. Turn off the stove. Take your medication. This is the realization that I am yours and you are mine. This is you forgetting. I wanted to just pause here and take a breath and see if anybody had a question or thank you for the comments. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. That poem has been published. A couple of them have been published, Patricia. This poem is in the current issue of Poetry, and there is if you go to Poetry Man, yep, that is it. A couple of others in different versions have been published also. Okay, I'm going to steel myself and go on. This is a poem that I really struggled with because, again, I suckered myself into thinking that this would be easy. And whenever I make that mistake, the problem is that what's easy is me talking as me instead of the Shekhinah, and then it just takes forever to cut that stuff away because I fall in love with my own voice, and getting rid of that is very hard. So I knew that there was something about the feeling of transience, and I found these two passages that seemed to go together, and I thought it would be easy, and it's been a struggle. The passage from Isaiah includes this: you say to yourself, I am, and there is none besides me. And the Cosmopolitan article is called the scary, scary way your friends are losing weight. And the poem is called Melting Away. I sit in the stubble of your heart, listening to you say, I am. I am, you say, and there is no one besides me, by which you mean no one to remember, no one to love, your wise and childish, tender, obsessive, intermittent selves, melting together, melting away. I am, I say, but you don't hear me. Tired and unhappy in your body, you want to be more and you want to be less, you want to be all or nothing. And you keep mistaking me for goodness or injustice or heart palpitations, when I'm the one, the only one, who sets your dust on fire. On good days, you wish I were there. On better days, you crave me. On the best days, you feel I am lifting the veil of your darkness, exposing your nakedness, loving your body's miraculous stubble, the clumps of hair in the shower, the strange shiny pleasures and cardiac butterflies, the love into which you are always falling, evaporating, one I am at a time. I am, I say, and there is no one besides me, by which I mean no other part of you that isn't melting away. One of the problems about that I've encountered in these poems. Oh, yes, Diane, this is, yeah, thank you. That was just what I was gonna say something about. In addition to the whole time thing, human syntax and human consciousness is based on the idea that there are parts, and there are, you have parts and you have relationships between parts. And the Shekhinah this drove Moses Maimonides nuts when he was looking at the way the Torah talks about God. He's like, no, God is just one and completely other and all one, and you can't chop God up into different parts the way human beings are always doing. But the thing about the Shekhinah is she's completely other than us and also completely us at the same time. And human language really does not do that very well, or at least I don't know how to do that very well with human language. So again and again, I keep getting, finding myself drawn into these sort of slip knots where that moment of dissolution between us and her happens. This poem also grew out of a personal experience of, I've been blessed to work with a trauma therapist named Bambi Ratner, who's taught me a lot about fragmentation and parts and things like that. And I realized, oh yeah, that's like another issue that the Shekhinah has with us. She sees our wholeness, but we see our brokenness and our partialness. And so this poem is dedicated to Bambi. It's called Fragmentation. The passage from Isaiah, one of my favorites, I guess it's one of everybody's favorites. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. And the Cosmo article is, I have 13 different identities living inside of me. Here's what our lives are like. Who gathers your pieces together? Pieces that can't see, pieces that can't hear, pieces blotted out by terror. You don't remember. You have so many histories and only one body for all the identities loving and living inside you, the way you live and love in me, no more or less real than anyone else, no less splintered, no closer to understanding why I summon you by name. You don't know what I'm talking about. You don't even know I'm talking. I am a deep dive you don't remember taking into multiple realities, multiple conceptions of self and other, and one inconceivable me fluttering above your terror that you can't do anything, or that you can, but only by being a different person, different from yourself, different from me. Don't be afraid. I walk with you through the fire, protecting the pieces you're afraid of losing, or maybe just afraid of, the children who suffer and never grow older, and the children who were never born, and the children who are nothing but gaps in your memory. How many of you are there? Does it matter? Your body has never been yours alone. I've always been here, holding every other into which you're broken. The jackals, the owls, the self-harming darkness, the splinters of shame and despair that tell you you deserve all the hate you get. I hold them so you can let them go. I remember so you can forget. I'm making you into something new, something unafraid, something infinite. I'm the labyrinth you feel lost inside, the ghost who never ghosts you, whose haunting keeps you alive. Sometimes the connections between poems are a little hard to tell, but I think this one is not. The next poem is called Real True Ghost Story. The passage from Isaiah includes the verse, I've put my words in your mouth and covered you with the shadow of my hand, which I realized is pretty creepy. Although I'm not sure God thinks of it that way. And the Cosmos store piece is 10 terrifying real ghost stories to tell at your next girls' night. And I have to say, a lot of these Cosmo articles are really well written. This is not one of them. This really sucks. Real true ghost story. Something is there, you think. Something that holds you from birth to death, like an antelope caught in a net, as heavens go up in smoke and worlds wear out like garments. Something that staggers you, dries up your waters, drains you to the dregs by whispering, I am. You aren't paralyzed, but can't get away, can't apologize, can't hide, can't pretend the way you did when you were a kid, that you've already died. Something is there that never sleeps. Something that can't be crushed or killed shoves its words into your mouth, forcing doors you try to close, whispering, I am. A body you aren't sure is yours sleeps in its shadow, like a half-empty rocking chair. You wonder if any of this actually happens, but you never wonder why it's so complex, so sickening, when I am masses in your mouth, in your bed, in the unexplained noise of forever, moving furniture above your head. On the other side of whatever you are, there's nothing but I am, a blessing that stumbles out of the kitchen and crawls across your skin. Time, a bowl, a drink of water, a nightmare trying to wake you up by singing in your ear. This poem also grows right out of the previous poem. It's called Awake, and we're heading toward the thrilling conclusion of the first section of Shekhinah Speaks. This is the penultimate poem. There's a wonderful passage of Isaiah that includes the words, awake, awake, clothe yourself with strength. And there's a really excellent Cosmo article called What Really Happens When You're in a Coma? You dream I'm looking down on you like a light on a ceiling, as though you were a thing and I were a thing, an object separate from your body, something you can blame for how you've been abused, a scar that lives in you, on you, has trouble breathing, sometimes bursts into song. You dream you're awake, trying to awake, to the presence holding you together like sticky surgical tape. Parts of you hurt, and parts are dying, and all of you is sick of feeling like you're nothing. You wonder why I let that happen, and why I don't help you escape, if I'm always there, looking down like a light on the ceiling, naked and shining, even in your dreams. You wonder, not because you're a badass, but because you feel rejected, embarrassed, broken in ways you cannot shake. If you are what I meant to create, what else could you be? The dream in which you see the light that never looks away is the glory of my love. That's when you're awake. And this is the final poem called Revelation, in which the Shekhinah is finally being heard by the you that she's been talking to. The quote from Isaiah is, I think it's one of the rare moments of out and out humor in Isaiah. God says, I revealed myself to those who didn't ask for me, which makes me feel like this is God's stripogram moment, you know, like God show you open the door and there's God doing a striptease and you're like, wait, I didn't send out for God. What's God doing here? And the Cosmo article is called, I Posed in a Bikini in Times Square. I can do this forever, but for you, it's now or never. You whisper, grin, push me away, question whether I was ever there. Tell yourself you don't have to answer, even if I am. Sometimes you provoke me to my face. Usually, though, you busy yourself with your own imagination, eating food that makes you hungry, worrying about money and what to do with your body, and wishing you could just stand still like a pool of water. What do I have to do to get your attention? Create a new earth and heaven? Been there, done that. I'm not here to be fetishized, forgotten, confused with your ideas of perfection. I'm what makes you sweat, sick, cursed, impure, ashamed, smoke in your nostrils that tells you something's burning. You're no one's plaything, not even mine. You are a vigil I keep, a flock I pasture, a grape on the vine still bursting with blessing, even at the end of harvest. And I'm the light you're afraid of losing, the light in which you can see that you and I are singing, me through you and you through me, a new song about what it means to be human. Not an indecipherable mess, not a pot of meat and feeling, or a headstone covered with body paint, or a burning garden, or irony sweating, not a creature starving for love. Love, I am revealing. Thank you. I don't know if y'all can, we have a few minutes left and I would love to hear somebody's voice other than mine. Oh, okay, Diane's writing a question. Why do you talk about identities? Is this not a binary form of self-difference? Is there another way you've thought about the way we're put together and how we demonstrate that? That is, yeah, that's a pretty fantastic question. And what I would say is the Shekhinah definitely doesn't think in terms of identities. I mean, the Shekhinah has only one you for every single one of us. Every single one of us that's alive now, but also every one of us that's ever lived. I'm not sure that there's, you know, there's the summons by name, but when the Shekhinah talks, I think it's all one you. And that totally dissolves identities. And the other thing that she does, and this has really challenged me the way I think Diane wanted to challenge me with that question, is that she does for us what Isaiah does with God. In Isaiah, God is always identifying in multiple shifting different ways. I cry out like a woman in childbirth, I'm an animal, I'm a, you know, a warrior, all of these identifications. And the Shekhinah talks to us that way too. You're this and you're this and you're this and you're this. It's like she's reminding us not that we're no more bounded by any of these identifying characteristics or boxes or ways of naming ourselves than she is, because we're umbilically connected to her, which is what she's saying in that very first poem, that there's a part of us that there's a part of our partialness that is umbilically connected to this unbounded wholeness. And so, the Shekhinah has really been a pain in the butt in certain kinds of ways, because I have worked very hard to work out ideas of identity. I mean, both for myself, but also I write about identity, and the Shekhinah is just summoning me to a perspective from which none of that really is a very useful way of thinking about being human. I mean, looking at people, and I try this sometimes. Thank you, Deb. I try this sometimes. I think, well, the Shekhinah says every individual person is love the Shekhinah is revealing. Wow. And it's hard for me to see myself that way, and it's also hard for me to see everyone else that way. But that just seems to moot the question of identity. Because in a way, it turns identity into what we use to mask the fact that what we really are is love that the divine is revealing through us. So, great question. I don't know, are you guys able to unmute?
People should be able to, if they can't, or there's a hand raise button on Zoom, which you can do, and I'll happily unmute anyone who wants to talk. But I think they're capable of unmuting themselves. I think they're just so in awe of the Shekhinah and your poetry that they may be catching their breath.
Well, I know the Shekhinah would want to unmute you.
I'll unmute. A pleasure to hear you read, Joy. Thank you so much for this. And to hear you talk about the Shekhinah, and to hear that the Shekhinah that you are hearing is so much like the one that I am hearing, even though mine does not speak. So beautiful. I want all of these. I want to be able to buy it now.
Well, I am willing to send unofficial, unproofed copies to anybody who's here who wants to send me an email at joyladin@gmail.com. I'll send you the copies of the poems that I read from. I'm happy to do that. Thank you.
Hi, Joy.
Hi.
These are gorgeous. Thank you. I'm sorry I had to join late because I was in a required class. And so if you explained this in the beginning, I apologize. But I'm curious specifically about your choice to pull language from Isaiah. I wrote a series recently for 929 on misogyny in Isaiah because I find it to be one of the more misogynistic texts we have. So I'm curious why that's the text that you chose to pull from for divine feminine goddess language or conceptualization.
So before I answer that, I'm really interested in what you were saying. What were you noticing in Isaiah that you were talking about? Because that's important.
I mean, you have to go into like specific instances, but generally Isaiah is very poetic, and the way that Isaiah tends to use metaphor is often overtly negative feminine imagery. So I can send you a link to the series that I wrote about it because it hones in on specific moments. But by and large, I find that few of our texts, prophetic or otherwise, have as much misogynistic metaphor as Isaiah does.
I would love to get that link. I always think that Ezekiel is the poster child for theological misogyny, but so I'm interested. I went to Isaiah not for the female imagery. I went to Isaiah because Second Isaiah is just such drop dead gorgeous poetry, and actually because God does not sound particularly human in those wonderful poetic monologues, which is weird. It sounds like great poetry, which is such a human thing, but the God who's speaking makes no sense to me as a human voice. The way God talks, it really does have this sort of chilly beyondness. and not just chilly. I mean, there's feeling, there's passion, and engagement, but it just doesn't sound like a human voice to me. And so I thought, if I'm looking for language which will give these poems a potential to have that quality of inhumanity, that would be a good source. So that's what drew me there. But no, I was relying on Cosmopolitan to give me the female stuff. I wouldn't go to a male prophet to do a woman's job.
I'm
Well,
wondering if Diane is trying to talk, but she's muted. It's possible that she's talking to someone else,
Oh.
but I'm just noticing that somebody's trying to talk, but it's muted. But would you like me to unmute you? It could be that somebody's talking. Yep.
Okay.
Oh, there we
Hi.
go.
Hi, thank you so
Hi.
much. I have to leave shortly for another meeting. I'm very, very curious about how the confluence of the theology and Cosmo worked for you as a poet. I mean, where do you locate yourself, your voice in that? Is my question clear, or am I?
The last part of it feels clear to me, but if I'm not answering the question you're asking, you have to correct me. So I was actually reaching for Cosmo and Isaiah because neither of them write like I do. Neither of them have a voice that sounds like me. And what disappointed me about the first Cosmo, Shekhinah poems that I wrote was that they were just my poems, but with a Shekhinah mask on. And they couldn't give me what I wanted, which was a way of hearing what the Shekhinah would be saying. When the Shekhinah is talking, like your question about identity, when I'm working through these poems, I feel like I'm getting somewhere when what the Shekhinah is saying feels uncomfortable. It feels like it's summoning me to think in ways that I don't usually think, or look at things from perspectives that aren't familiar to me, like what you were saying about identity. Yeah, this identity that I've worked so hard on is just completely irrelevant to what she is seeing in me, and the ways that she's summoning me to see myself. So so that's the value that I've seen. And there's some Cosmo articles that have proved productive sources that are of the suckier variety. There's like a wedding shopping article, and there's the ghost story article. That's really awful. That's like stuff from Twitter and really badly written language. But a lot of the pieces that have been most productive are first person narratives, like The Woman with Dissociative Order really writes wonderfully. The woman writing about having been in a coma, that is an amazing article. And sometimes they're difficult to use as sources because when I'm using articles as sources, I need to ignore what they're saying and just try to skim them for language that jumps out for other kinds of reasons. And the best written articles keep distracting me with what they're saying, and then I just want to quote chunks of them. And it's like, you can't have a Shekhinah poem that says, yeah, what she said. You have to actually, break up this material and allow it to be recombined so something else emerges out of it. But yeah, at their best, these poems should not sound like me. I want them to be much more than what I could do.
I really do have to leave because I must be on a phone call, but there's something that is disconnecting for me when you say that it shouldn't sound like you as the poet. As the poet, I want it to sound like you. In other words, when I read a poem by whomever, it's not because I want it to sound like someone else. It's through the poet and who the poet is that is also very interesting to me and informative and enlivening. So I'm like a little jammed in that you don't want it to sound like you. And who do you want it to sound like? And I have to go, but I'm going to be back next week for more of this. Thank you all. I'm really so sorry to have to leave. I thought the time was 1:30 and I arranged my whole schedule around that. So I need to go. So I'm sorry.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'll
for
see you next
staying.
week. Bye. Bye.
Joy,
all.
if I could just sort of add to that question, I mean, it just, you know, like I was thinking as you were reading and as you were talking about Ezekiel and Isaiah and the biblical poets, I mean, I wonder if whether as a poet you can give us even a glimmer of insight into what may have been in the mind of Ezekiel or Isaiah. You know, how does one perhaps channel something other than themselves writing poetry?
Well, I always like dumping on Ezekiel. So I want to take Ezekiel first. I think for me, the problem with Ezekiel is that it really does sound like what I imagine Ezekiel is. I feel like he has this character, which includes misogyny, and it includes this kind of, there's something very, I guess maybe it's just a neuro difference from me. He's very, very interested in all of these details, and there's something very plotting to me about most of the way that he writes, which I don't hear as being the divine. Whereas when God, and when in the part of the first half of Isaiah, most of that also sounds like a human being more than it sounds like God speaking through a human being. The parts of Isaiah that, and I'm guessing that Sivan is going to give me another perspective on this, but the parts of Isaiah that that I love the most do sound more, rather than like Isaiah making a God sock puppet, it's more like God is using an Isaiah sock puppet. So there's the limitation or shaping or qualities of the human voice. All of the references, for example, none of the words are not words in biblical Hebrew. I'm assuming that God experiences, sees, and feels things for which there is no human language, but none of that makes it into the divine monologues in Isaiah because God is speaking through a human being. So that would be my ideal of the Shekhinah poems, is just, I guess it's kind of like what stained glass windows do to sunlight. There's a vast difference between the sun that produces the light and the stained glass window that gives it color and form. So, and you can't have the effect of the stained glass window without both the sunlight and the stained glass window. So you can't have the quality of the human prophets if you only have a divine voice. If you only have a divine voice, I'm guessing you mostly have what happens in Genesis. You know, you have worlds growing up, you have reality taking shape. The exciting thing about having the human voice, the stained glass window, is that you get divinity, you get what happens. It's like that singing at the end in the last poem. It's like God singing through the human creates something that God couldn't achieve without singing through the human, without that limitation, without that coloration of the human, that kind of specificity that the human demands. And for some reason, I'm really not God, so I don't really get this. But for some reason, that's something that God obviously values, or we wouldn't have bothered to have that let there be light, that whole process of differentiation that starts and results in so many things that are, you know, such fragments from God's perspective. But all of our fragments enable God to be manifested in specific ways that you don't get with just undifferentiated being. It's like, I don't prefer the Big Bang to what came after the Big Bang. I'm not dying to get back to one undifferentiated mass of energy that's exploding outward. I kind of like the results of differentiation and relationship and stuff. So it seems to me that God does also. But I do feel like you can, when I read the prophets, they sound different. They have different flavors, even when they all sound, even in the parts where it sounds to me like God is speaking through them. And I assume without any basis, that that's the human part. That's the stained glass window that is shaping the divine voice that's speaking through them. Sivan?
Yeah, maybe this is just a seed to plant for a future session, especially because I think that we're at the end of your session. But so much of what you say when you speak about your theology of the Shekhinah, or what I'm reading as your theology of the Shekhinah, and much of what I've heard in your poems, particularly the third to last poem that you've read, reminds me of what I think of when I think of the concept of the muse, and of where does poetry come from for the poet, or art for the artist, or music for the composer, etc. And so I'd love in maybe a future session to hear you and maybe someone else speak about that concept of like divinity and the muse, and you know, where are they different, and how do they come to us?
What a great idea. When you email me the link to your article, you should let me know if you'd like to have that conversation with me. We can, since you're hanging out with me anyway at that time.
I'm going to sign off. My daughter needs me and I have to go, but I love this. Thank you so much. And I also want to hear the muse idea that Sivan mentioned. So you better tag me in the conversation.
Thank you
Okay,
so
bye
much
everyone.
for being here.
Thank you so much,
Bye.
Joy. I enjoyed this so much.
Thank you,
Bye.
Joy.
Bye.